you've spent even a little time online, YouTube, Twitch, TikTok, you've probably seen the edges of it, the bones. Maybe you've noticed a friend's recommendations start to shift, the thumbnails get a little bit wilder, maybe their For You page turns a little strange, and then suddenly, someone you care about, your cousin, your coworker, your crunchy friend from high school, is saying shit that feels off. Because the alt-right pipeline isn't just a vibe. It's real, a documented process, funnel, a worldview built out of memes, comment sections, reaction videos, and algorithmic nudges. One that pulls disaffected people further right, bit by bit, without them even realizing it. And there are creators who have done some incredible work breaking this down, like Matt Bernstein's crunchy too far right pipeline, how wellness and anti-establishment aesthetics morph into conspiracies and ethno-nationalism. We have creators like Leah Miller's Manosphere to alt-right pipeline, where she goes through how male grievance becomes a gateway drug to radical right thinking. Now, I have watched a lot of video essays like these, but what I kept thinking was, okay, why does this pipeline exist in the first place? Why does everything seem greased to one slide in one direction? Why do so many different kinds of people, like from queer-coded anime boys to crunchy moms to suburban dads, how do they all end up in the same algorithmic cul-de-sac? And yes, maybe this is where I admit that I struggled with where to start, because answering that question of who laid the alt-right pipe, it can pull you back pretty far. Like collapse of feudalism far. At some point, I had to draw a line so this didn't turn into a 3-hour dissertation with a bibliography worthy of a post-grad thesis. But eventually I landed here. A pipeline implies infrastructure. Infrastructure means a plan. And a plan means someone laid it. So yeah, when I ask who laid the alt-right pipe, I do mean it in a little bit of a cheeky way, because if we're all getting fucked by something, we should probably understand the mechanism of the fuckery. And look, sometimes that mechanism is cousin Greg discovering powerlifting and then suddenly blaming women for his loneliness. And sometimes it's your neighbor Pam watching Blake Lively gossip videos from Brett Cooper and suddenly putting beef tallow on her face and preaching about raw milk and ancestral living or weird shit like deodorant is a government psyop. But all of those things are just entry points. And not to stretch the metaphor too far, but I guess I am. I think we need to ask 2 questions. What is the pipe made out of? And who laid it? All right. Hell of an intro. I'm Anjanette. This is Girly Politics. Let's get into it. And by it, I mean I have to open the very first episode of Girly Politics by talking about men. I know. But to answer the fundamental question, what is the pipe made of? Our journey, unfortunately, begins there. And the constituent parts? Those are pretty simple. Patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism. So we will unpack those fun ingredients before we have to dive into the structure itself. So deep sigh, patriarchy. I truly wish we didn't have to go here, but alas, masculinity is a major player in this whole pipeline mess. And the uncomfortable truth is you can't talk about the alt-right pipeline without staring directly into the heart of American masculinity. It's not a subplot. It's a lead role in this ongoing and frankly tragic production. Think about it. When we ask who built this pipeline, we're not just pointing to shadowy billionaires or right-wing think tanks. We're also asking, who defines manhood in America? Who writes the rules, lays the groundworks, shapes the expectations? Because the alt-right pipeline doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It is built on top of a deeply patriarchal foundation. It taps into the anxiety around what it means to be a real man in this country. And let's be real, it's never just one thing. This isn't a whodunit where we catch one villain twirling his mustache. This is a toxic cocktail. And two of the strongest ingredients are whiteness and a very brittle, very specific kind of masculinity. It's the type of masculinity that insists to feel powerful, someone else must feel powerless. Often that someone is a woman, or a queer person, or a person of color, or all of the above. And no, this isn't some primal, hard-wired instinct rising from the caveman depth. This need to dominate. It's not biological destiny. It's programming. It's social. It's cultural. It's a historical code that gets installed early and runs in the background, mostly invisible and deeply internalized. Honestly, sometimes it feels like this whole thing is just one giant, incredibly sad dick measuring contest. Not about real strength, not about resilience, just performance. Constant, exhausting performance. A really hollow masculinity. The type that's haunted by this fear of being exposed as not enough. And what's wild to me is that feminism has always offered men a way out of this. A different script, a bigger role. As historian Natalie Davis once said, women created gender studies to illuminate overlooked histories, yet men remain blind to how gender shapes their own lives. Masculinity is treated like a default, neutral, natural, untouched by history. But it's not. And to give you another quote back to back, there's a sociologist, Michael Kimmel, who put it like this: "We have endowed manhood with mythical, timeless qualities, as if some eternal masculine essence lives in every man's heart." And what he means by that is that we tend to think of, quote unquote, being a man as this unchanging thing, like it's always been the same, rather than something that society constantly shapes and constantly redefines. Manhood isn't eternal, right? It's adaptive, it's fragile, and it freaks the fuck out when this world starts to shift, when old roles don't fit, and when new roles start to feel unfamiliar or threatening. That's when the alt-right steps in. Because, you see, the alt-right doesn't just offer ideology, it offers identity. It offers a costume. It offers a club, a sense of certainty in a world that feels chaotic. And the casting call for this brand of manhood? White, straight, native-born, often Christian. And anyone who doesn't fit this is the enemy. Anyone inside who questions it, a traitor. But this crisis, it isn't new. American masculinity has always been a house of cards. Like, back during the Revolution, the United States cast Britain as this decadent, effeminate father and styled itself as the rugged, self-made man. Masculinity became a stand-in for national strength. Even John Adams was super stressed about it. In a letter that he wrote to Thomas Jefferson, he said, "You tell me how to prevent riches from producing luxury, and luxury from producing effeminacy, intoxication, extravagance, vice, and folly." You can hear the panic. Well, maybe not. I didn't read that very panicked, but the panic is there, right? There is this fear that comfort would somehow soften a man, that too much ease would make them less manly. And American masculinity has always been haunted by this question of, how do we keep our men tough? Ooh, softness of any kind. That's a European thing, I guess. And it wasn't just about gender either. So it was also tied to economics too. So like in 1837, there was a journalist named Francis Grund, who wrote, "A man in America is not despised by being poor in the outset. Every year which passes without adding to his prosperity is a reproach to his understanding of industry." Translation, if you're not rising, you're failing. And if you're not providing, you are not a man. From the beginning, manhood has been a mess of contradictions, wanting to be rugged, yet, respectable, dominant, yet virtuous, self-made, but never soft. So if the alt-right is nostalgic for some golden era of manhood, maybe what they're really mourning is the myth that their forefathers ever had it figured out in the first place. We have always had an identity crisis. I mean, don't tell Donald Trump that the forefathers would have actually literally vomited at his gold-encrusted, foppish decadence. It's actually really wild how manliness is so incredibly flexible to alt-right men, while they are so determined to keep it shackled to some kind of heteronormative biological binding. Okay, it's a quick aside, kind of a funny story. But do you know about the shortest lived presidency? A dude named William Harrison. So he died in office after catching pneumonia during his inauguration because he refused to cancel the thing due to the weather, since his whole campaign was about how manly he was. And manly presidents, I guess, underdress and defy the weather. And he died for it. Like, this should be taught as a history lesson in every single middle school class. Like a giant warning to boys that they are not invulnerable, but their posturing of invulnerability is what will eventually hurt them. Like, it's crazy. Okay, fast forward to now, and you'll see this same fear. Only it's digitized, weaponized, memeified. So you have problematic playwright David Mamet. He put it like this. I thought it was succinct. Women rank so low on the social ladder that men can't define themselves through female approval. What men crave is validation from other men. And that's the key. This is about what's called homosociality. It's a masculinity obsessed not just with domination, but with recognition, but only from other men, especially when the traditional markers of manhood, a job, a status, control, feel out of reach. The alt-right pipeline becomes a feedback loop of male approval, men performing for men, auditioning for a role in a hyper-masculine reboot of Fight Club, but it's live streamed on Kick. The performance becomes everything. But underneath this performance, what is there? Fear. It's a fear of softness. It's a fear of being seen as feminine. It's a fear of being gay. It's a fear of literally feeling anything at all. Hence the F slur. The F slur is dropped like a flare gun anytime emotional intelligence enters the chat, because feeling is coded as soft, and softness is coded as feminine, and femininity is seen as weakness. So men repress, they harden, they lash out. And let's be crystal clear here. This is not a strength, right? This is just fear dressed up in a leather jacket that has a podcast mic. So when you have figures like Andrew Tate or alt-right streamers bark about dominance, they're not showing power. What they're really doing is they're revealing their panic. And for those who do not know, I don't know how you wouldn't know if you're listening to this, But Andrew Tate is just human garbage, right? He's an kickboxer who gained huge popularity for like super aggressive, misogynistic views, especially with young dudes. He is probably one of the biggest examples of what the pipeline looks like in action today. He's also, minor note, been accused and indicted for human trafficking and rape. So, I mean, very aspirational character we have here. And for the guys, they get pipelined to him when maybe all they wanted was to like up their rep count or something. I do honestly find that sad, because the young men caught in this pipeline, they're not just chasing power. They're not just, chasing an ideal of themselves. They're also looking for protection because they feel scared, because they feel ashamed, because they're lonely. And the alt-right offers them armor, and they give them a script and a place. But at what cost, right? So they get belonging, but only if they disavow vulnerability. They get identity, but only through exclusion. And they get purpose only by playing a role that keeps them emotionally stunted and isolated. And honestly, that's the devastating irony. It's a massive L disguised as swagger. Because in the end, this version of masculinity doesn't just harm women and marginalize folks. It devours men from the inside out. It teaches them that to feel is to fail, that to connect is to collapse, that to be anything other than hard is to be nothing at all. And like hard, not like, okay. Is it any wonder, though, that we're seeing a loneliness epidemic, especially among young men? The alt-right pipeline promises power, but delivers alienation. And in that story, like always, everybody loses. When we talk about the alt-right pipeline, the image we usually conjure up is male, angry, maybe incel-coded, maybe YouTube-pilled, definitely loud. But systems of power don't survive on aggression alone. Patriarchy, like white supremacy, doesn't just need enforcers. It needs hosts, curators, teachers, gatekeepers, enablers, people who make domination feel normal, even nice. And that is where women come in. This isn't about individual choices or blaming people for their identities. Okay, this is about structural complicity, the way that white women across a political spectrum have been positioned to uphold patriarchy and quite frequently rewarded for doing so, even when it does eventually harm them as well. Because patriarchy doesn't just need men. It needs someone to socialize the next generation of boys into dominance. It needs someone to police femininity, to enforce beauty standards. It needs someone who will ask for respect instead of demanding justice, and shame others for being too loud, too angry, or too disruptive. And that's why Mikki Kendall, in Hood Feminism, in a quote that I keep returning to because it connects so many of these threads, writes, "Polite white people who respond to calls for respect, for getting boots off necks with demands for decorum, aren't interested in resistance or disruption. They are interested in control. They insist that they know best what should be done when attempting to battle and defeat bias. But in actuality, they're just happy to be useless. They're oppression tourists, virtue signaling volunteers, straddling white supremacy and being woke. And they have less power than they think. But like any small predator, they manage to be flashy enough to be seen." What Kendall is describing here is a kind of liberal complicity. White women who believe themselves to be allies, but whose primary goal is to keep things emotionally manageable, to flatten tension, rather than to confront injustice. And that's not just an interpersonal failing. That's a structural function of white femininity in a patriarchal white supremacist system, right? So white women are often coded as soft, innocent, believable, victims first. And when that social coding gets paired with the emotional labor of feminism, it creates this dynamic where control gets mistaken for care, where comfort becomes a political value, where politeness itself becomes the weapon. That's not just inconvenient, that's actually very dangerous. Nikole Hannah-Jones put it quite bluntly when she said, "Too often, white women can be the most dangerous women of all, because they are allowed to dissemble and disarm in ways that women of color are not, because people believe them." And that belief, that trust, it has been used throughout history to maintain power structures. From white women managing enslaved people in the American South, to the temperance movement's role in criminalizing Black men, to the fact that about 53% of white women voted for Trump twice. Okay, so I am white, and statistically, the only reason I don't fall into that specific Trump voting block is because I'm college educated. And that's not reassuring. That's terrifying. It's terrifying that apparently we require a liberal arts degree in order to see the humanity of people who don't look like us. That is not a sign of progress. That is a crisis of imagination. It's a failure of solidarity. It's just a lack of curiosity and courage. And that failure doesn't just serve white patriarchy, it protects it. Because when a white woman calls the cops, she knows who will be believed. The truth about Emmett Till didn't come out for decades. You know, God only knows what secrets have never come out. When white women largely voted for Trump, they knew what they were protecting. They were protecting whiteness, they were protecting property, and they were protecting power. It is a stark it's a stark reminder that this isn't just about passive protection. Historically, it's been active participation. We often hear about men in white hoods, but let's not forget that white women who, in some instances, literally held bake sales to raise money for lynchings, like just a little KKK cookie, that charming, polite veneer of white femininity has, for far too long, been deployed not just to uphold norms, but to actively fund and facilitate terror. So if we're asking who built the alt-right pipeline, we have to look at who laid the emotional groundwork. We have to look at who sanitized the rhetoric. We have to see who was it that asked for civility when the house was on fire. Because maybe white women didn't invent the pipeline, but they definitely helped make it acceptable. They definitely helped clear the path forward. All right, so we have looked at masculinity, and we have looked at white women's role within patriarchy. For our last little section here of what makes up the pipe, we're going to talk about capitalism. So, in the 18th century, we have philosophers like Adam Smith. They did not just describe markets. They redefined humanity, right? Their whole homo economicus was a creature, pure interest, self-interest, rational to the point of being emotionally sterile. Basically, just look out for number one, yourself. Like that was the whole vibe. Capitalism needed a new psychology. You were no longer a member of a village or a faith or a family. Instead, you became an individual actor, solely responsible for your own survival. Your worth, measured in productivity. Your failures, those were moral, not systemic. For millennia, identity had been relational. You were a parent, you were a neighbor, you were a believer. But with the rise of capitalism, you were recast as a consumer or a worker or a competitor. When your very sense of self depended on outperforming others, solidarity began to look a little bit like weakness. But 19th century factory didn't just change labor, it rewired human connection. Marx saw it early. Capitalism doesn't just exploit your labor, it severs you from its meaning. The craftsman who once took pride in his work has become a cog. Like, imagine if you used to make the whole shoe, right? You saw the finished product and you saw the happy customer. You felt connected to your work in making the shoe. But at a factory, you might just be putting on the same buckle on shoes all day, every day. You don't see the shoe completed. You don't meet the customer. You don't get a feeling of purpose. Like, any sense of community that might have existed there is gone. So I really think that the pipe thrives on isolation because capitalism manufactured it through company towns, child labor, the destruction of guilds. Like, these weren't just economic shifts. These were social amputations. Like, hello, of course we're lonely. Though, for a brief, shining moment after World War II, for some Americans, it felt like capitalism could deliver on its promise. Union power was stronger, wages were rising, and a single earner could actually support their family. This created the illusion of a stable, broad-based prosperity. That was my dog. Becky, go to bed. Okay, but even this golden age was built on exclusion, on racial covenants, on redlining, and a systemic denial of opportunities for Black and Brown Americans, ensuring that seeds of inequality were already sown. Meanwhile, post-war, production was booming, but people had to be trained to want more. This ushered in an advertising revolution. Madison Avenue didn't just sell products, it sold identities. A Marlboro wasn't just a cigarette, it was masculinity in a pack. A dishwasher wasn't just an appliance, it was a good wife certification. The message was clear: you are what you buy. Then came the neoliberal turn. The mid to late 20th century saw a ruthless shift away from manufacturing and towards finance, services, and automation. Good-paying, often unionized factory jobs that provided stable pathways to the middle class began to disappear. Corporations increasingly prioritized maximizing returns for shareholders above all else, leading to aggressive cost-cutting, outsourcing jobs abroad, and dismantling benefits and fighting unions. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, they didn't just slash taxes, they systematically severed the last threads of collective identity. When Thatcher declared in 1987, there is no such thing as society, she wasn't describing reality, she was enforcing it. Unions crushed, public spaces defunded, healthcare, personal responsibility. The result was a world where every crisis became yours and yours alone to fix. And Ronald Reagan, he didn't just inherit a political movement. He amplified and popularized ideas that had been brewing in conservative think tanks for decades. The Heritage Foundation, for instance, provided the intellectual ammunition for his presidency. Reaganomics wasn't just about tax cuts and deregulation. It was a psychological and cultural operation, meticulously planned and executed. Famously, he declared, "Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem." This wasn't just merely a policy statement. It was a complete reframing of American civil life, systematically eroding trust in public institutions and social safety nets, and the very idea of any sort of collective responsibility. Think about the firing of the air traffic controllers in 1981. This wasn't just about breaking a strike. It was a chilling, symbolic demonstration of this new individualism, a direct assault on labor unions and collective bargaining that sent a clear message to those about who held power and whose freedom mattered most. This era really cemented the idea that solidarity was weakness and self-reliance, even in the face of systemic hardship, was the prevailing ideology, popularized by a smiling president and supported by a robust network of think tanks, which tells you that every problem is a personal failing and every collective solution is government overreach. And this was not accidental. These weren't just the organic ideas of a charismatic leader. They were the culmination of a long-term, deliberate project to fundamentally reshape American society, with a project whose blueprints we'll uncover later when we talk a little bit more about the architecture of the pipeline. But fast forward to 2014 and the whole anti-social justice warrior thing, where YouTubers aren't just like selling ideology, right? They were selling aesthetic. So the pipeline here works because it's offering a prepackaged self, the intellectual dark web tea, the facts of your feelings mug, the tradwife apron, or whatever the 2014 equivalent of that was. You just need to add a dash of grievance, and there you go. This systematic erosion of collective power, coupled with the hollowing out of the middle class by globalization and automation, paved the way for the gig economy and really precarious labor. The insidious meritocracy myth became even more cruel because it says that if you're struggling, it's your fault. It's not the systemic failures of the system that replace safety nets with self-help grifts. This manufactured shame and resentment is exactly what the alt-right exploits. They don't criticize capitalism. They redirect legitimate economic anxieties towards cultural enemies. They point to immigrants. They point to feminists, to quote-unquote woke culture. When you have no real community, you'll pay for one with conspiracy theories. When they offer the promise of restoration to some bygone era of stability and dominance, often tying it to racial or gender hierarchies. This laid the groundwork for our modern day incel, the QAnon, oh my God, the Q people, the Pizzagate people, those people, they laid the gate for them. The anti-woke bro. Like, none of these are random pathologies. They are the logical end of the system that thrives on isolation, and then it monetizes people's discontent. Okay, cool. We have looked at the main parts of what the pipe is. What does the pipeline look like in action? If you are not like me, you might not, in your free time, watch right-wing commentators on YouTube. I do, unfortunately, quite frequently. I usually just get like super mad when I'm watching it. It's probably not great, but hey, right now it's creating content. So there's this one YouTuber that I watch in particular. Her name is Amala Ekpunobi, who has over 2 million subscribers. And a while back, she released a video called "You're on the Alt-Right Pipeline." Obviously said like sarcastically because she doesn't think that she plays a role in this. Excuse me. And I want to start this section by reading how she begins that video of hers. Okay. Believe it or not, guys, I have interests outside of politics. I like music, art, movies, celebrity drama. Every now and then, sports sometimes. But apparently, if I engage with you guys on those subject matters, I could be placing you on the alt-right pipeline. That's right, guys. I could be luring you in with normal topics and then turning you into a white supremacist Nazi, at least according to some leftists on the internet. So right now, let's talk about the alt-right pipeline. All right, so let's talk about that. So what Amala does here, and what so many of these creators do, is perform the very mechanism that they claim to be mocking. Pipeline doesn't work because a PragerU video screams, "Become a Nazi." It works because someone like Amala wraps political ideology inside a cozy little blanket of pop culture, irony, and parasocial charm. She says, "I like music, I like movies, I like gossip. I'm just like you." And that's the blueprint. That's how the pipeline works. You start with shared culture. You disarm critique with irony. You build emotional resonance. Then slowly redefine what normal looks like until that normal quietly centers reactionary thought. Later in the video, she doubles down. She says, "I like Kendrick Lamar's music. I definitely disagree with his politics. Just because I listen to Not Like Us or watched his Super Bowl performance doesn't mean that I'm on the radical left pipeline. Like I'm going to go attend a BLM protest or throw a Molotov cocktail at a police station." So this is the hollow core of conservative cultural discourse. It pretends to be apolitical while actively reshaping how people understand politics. So in this example, Amala turns Kendrick Lamar into just background noise. She streams his protest music like a vibe, like not a reckoning. She drains any sort of meaning from his music while posing as, "I'm just relatable." To engage with the politics behind his work would mean confronting the fact that Black art, especially, often emerges as a response to state violence, not just a cool beat or a vibe playlist. And that's part of the emotional labor of the pipeline, right? It doesn't radicalize through argument. It seduces through emotion. I mean, if you take like Ben Shapiro, I know he's fallen off lately, but in his heyday, he was all like, "Facts don't care about your feelings," when the dude was low-key obsessed with vibes. And his facts got completely molded around them. For all their talk of cold, hard data, much of their appeal and the alt-right pipeline's effectiveness lies in managing emotions and creating a very specific vibe. It's a classical rhetorical trick. By constantly asserting that facts are paramount and emotions are irrelevant, they try to discredit any arguments that stem from empathy, from lived experience, or from moral outrage. Yet, if you look at their content, it often operates on a deeply emotional level. They cultivate feelings of grievance, of fear, of superiority, or even just camaraderie among their audience. I mean, think about it. So, quote unquote, owning the libs, that mentality isn't about logical debate. It's about the satisfaction of perceived dominance. The constant outrage bait isn't to present new information. It's to trigger a visceral reaction. It's why I personally don't fuck with debate bros. They like DM me and I don't fuck with them because it doesn't matter what I say. They just want to dominate, right? There's no actual logical curiosity. It's about owning the libs. That's all it is. So the mocking and dismissal of marginalized groups, that isn't based on evidence. It's to reinforce a sense of belonging among those who share similar prejudices. So while they outwardly reject feelings, they very masterfully manipulate the emotional landscape to draw people in and solidify their worldview. It's the ultimate hypocrisy, pretending to be purely rational while building an entire media ecosystem on a foundation of curated emotions and shared vibes. This is precisely why you have figures like Amala who can take something like Kendrick Lamar's music and strip it of its political and emotional context and present it as just background noise. They sanitize everything that might provoke genuine introspection or uncomfortable feelings, replacing it with a comforting, often ironic detachment. It allows people to feel politically engaged without ever having to confront the underlying issues of their own biases. Like, of course, right, watching Amala doesn't automatically make you a fascist. But the point is, these platforms don't just serve content. They shape context. And over time, context becomes quote-unquote common sense. You watch someone like Ben or Asmongold or Amala. You laugh at the libs. You shrug at fascism. You vibe to Kendrick. You just want to complain about video game characters not being hot. Whatever. It all seems low stakes. But that's the trick. It doesn't feel like propaganda. It feels like hanging out. And full disclosure, I watched Asmongold on Twitch yesterday, covering the protests in LA. And my brain knows, more than half my brain knows that he's a grifter. He doesn't understand historical context. He doesn't engage with politics on any serious level. He's not very smart. But part of my brain also can look at him, listen to him, and understand the vibes, because what he says feels like common sense. Like when he says something like, oh, the best way to protest, obviously in a legal capacity. And it sounds kind of reasonable, right? Until you realize completely skips over the fact that civil disobedience has to break the law sometimes, because the law isn't some moral arbiter. It's just power that has been solidified and centralized. By the way, I only subscribe to one Twitch streamer, and it is not him. I said I understand the grift, not that I buy into it. Okay, disclaimer over. But for those of you who fall for the grift, you start to think, maybe the problem isn't the police state or white supremacy or the concentration of power. Maybe the problem is the people who take things too seriously. Maybe the problem is the radical left. Maybe politics is just annoying. And another aside, actually, one of my upcoming episodes is probably gonna talk about nuance and the flattening of nuance, because I think this is a whole episode-worthy thing that the right does very insidiously, but the left does in a way that is actually kind of annoying, and it gives the right a lot of fodder sometimes. Anyways, so that's how it starts, right? Because the pipeline isn't just about content, it is about tone. It teaches you that anger is cringe, that theory is elitist, and caring is so embarrassing. It's not an intellectual funnel. It is a vibes funnel. We live in a attention economy that feeds on disaffection. The algorithms don't care what you believe. They care what you watch. And what keeps you watching is friction, conflict, spectacle, and parasocial drama. And content that flattens your biases while letting you pretend that you're above it all. The right understands this deeply. Builds media ecosystems that say, don't worry about the world. Just hang out with me. I will tell you who the bad guys are. And the scary part is, it feels good. It's low effort. It's emotionally satisfying. It's tailor-made for burnout. There's this one Korean philosopher, Byung-Chul Han, who wrote about this in a book, might be a paper, I think it was a book that he wrote called The Burnout Society. He argues that domination in modern life doesn't operate through force. It operates through seduction, where we self-optimize, we self-brand, we self-exploit. We grind ourselves into dust and think that this is freedom. And it's wild because capitalism doesn't really need to oppress us anymore because we do it ourselves lovingly with, like pastel time trackers and Notion dashboards. And, okay, pause. Because I may or may not have spent an embarrassing number of hours on Duolingo thanks to, like, K-pop and manhwa. And, like, Duolingo for Korean, at least, is so weird. Like, I learned the useless things like the fox's milk. Why is that relevant ever? But bonus, I think I have a decent pronunciation for being able to pronounce hot Korean dudes' names. So I can say it with my full chest right now. 안녕하세요, 교수님. I said hello, professor. Respectfully, Byung-Chul. It's a handsome man. Okay, I'd be so distracted in his lectures. I guess he lectures in Germany. But anyways, what Professor Byung-Chul is naming is the same force that fuels the alt-right pipeline, where it is seduction as strategy. And not seduction like hotness, like him. Seduction through validation, through familiarity, through that soft, cozy, I'm just like you feeling. Because the pipeline doesn't begin with manifesto. It begins with a meme, a joke, a TikTok, a podcast. And soft radicalization that's just disguised as relatability. That's why this isn't just about Amala. It's not even just about the right. It's about how digital culture, the design of platforms, the monetization of engagement, the flattening of all speech into content creates the conditions for radicalization. It's about how media teaches people to trade politics for personality and how emotion, not logic, is the real engine of ideology. So when people say, you're on the alt-right pipeline, they don't mean you're about to goose step down the street. They mean you're already absorbing the framework, that politics is fake, that emotions are weakness, that solidarity is cringed, that solidarity is cringed, and that real problems are manufactured. You start by rolling your eyes at pronouns or something. But at the end of this, you might start thinking that people like Derek Chauvin might have had a point. And by then, it's not about ideas anymore. It's about identity. It's about who you trust, who you listen to, who makes you feel good. The pipeline is real, and it's paved with jokes and reaction vids and chill vibes and a friendly face that says, I'm just like you. So finally, we are getting to what the pipe infrastructure kind of looks like. So we've talked about what it's made of: patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism. So who laid it? Because if we're talking about a pipeline, that implies an architect, right? A master builder with some sort of blueprint. And if you're looking for the intellectual architect of the modern right, and by extension, a huge part of the alt-right pipeline, we're about to meet the quiet little freak who designed it. And no, it's not Stephen Bannon or some 4chan edgelord. It is a gentleman named James McGill Buchanan, a Nobel Prize-winning economist who looked at Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 and went, what if we reframed our racism as the right to not associate with Black people? So, Buchanan and his allies, I said that weird. Buchanan and his allies had a clear vision of economic liberty. But the American people, they weren't buying it. So I am talking about the 1964 presidential election where Barry Goldwater, their standard bearer, sorry, my dog wants me to take off this little vest. You okay? So I'm talking about the 1964 presidential election where Barry Goldwater was their, man with a plan, right? He suffered, a horrible, horrible defeat, though. And it became a really pivotal moment in this whole blueprint. because it exposed a fundamental flaw in their strategy. Don't chew your bone. That's too loud. Wow. I apologize if his bone chewing right now is going to be really fucking loud. So, pivotal moment exposed because huge flaw in the strategy. They have been trying to win public opinion through direct persuasion. And they find out that doesn't really work. Because Goldwater ran a campaign that was a stark referendum on their ideas. And he lost by a landslide. Because he openly attacked wildly popular programs. Like, he called for selling off the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was deeply unpopular in the Southeast. He advocated for making Social Security, quote unquote, voluntary. What does that mean? A move that would make the system completely collapse. Like, that makes zero sense. And he dismissed Medicare as socialized medicine, which, greatest hits, right? So even though medical insurance for the elderly was broadly favored across the country, he thought that was a good idea. So crucially, though, his campaign was steered by figures like Warren Nutter, who deliberately replaced the Republican Party's long-standing support for civil rights with the calls for states' rights. Goldwater himself embraced that freedom not to associate, a direct challenge to desegregation. And the stance obviously outraged veteran Black Republicans and even alienated moderate white voters in the North. He famously declared, extremism is the defense of liberty. He famously declared, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. A line his team, including Buchanan's allies, understood as a defense of their uncompromising vision of a free society rooted in unchecked capitalism. For Buchanan, this wasn't just political defeat. It was a profound lesson in the perils of popular democracy. If the majority kept voting for federal programs and social safety, could their vision of a minimal government ever succeed? While some libertarians, like Milton Friedman, believed that they could eventually win over voters one by one, Buchanan drew a bleaker, more strategic conclusion. Direct persuasion wouldn't work. And this is where William F. Buckley's insight becomes pathetic. After the Goldwater loss, Buckley told young conservatives that a great sea change in American public opinion hadn't been achieved, and he urged them to see that a counter-revolution takes years of careful preparation. This wasn't about winning the next election. It was about a long-term systemic effort to change the very rules of the game. And isn't that just it? The big shifts rarely happen overnight. It's the quiet persistence, chipping away that truly transforms things. Often for the better, or in this case, the worse. So Buchanan's ideas and his base at the University of Virginia were also under threat. The state itself was democratizing. Jesus fucking Christ, I'm tired. It's 1 a.m. Okay. The state itself was democratizing, shedding the influence of the old bird machine that had protected segregation. UVA was opening up, attracting more diverse students, and seeking federal grants, which directly crashed with Buchanan's anti-federalist, anti-integration worldview. So adding to his frustrations, Buchanan's own intellectual project at UVA faced internal challenges. His economics department was criticized by admin and colleagues for being rigidly committed to a single point of view and creating a closed society that stifled intellectual pluralism. Ford Foundation, a potential funder, even noted their dogmatism. The irony was really stark. An enterprise founded to preserve liberty was being accused of authoritarianism. Like, you can't make this stuff up, right? It's almost too perfect a parable for how power can twist its own intentions. From this position of perceived vulnerability, Buchanan refined his intellectual weaponry. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, what happens when people feel cornered and threatened? Sometimes they double down on the very ideas that caused the friction in the first place. It's very much that meme of like sticking a branch into the wheels of your bike and like crashing and then crying about it like you're being victimized. That's Buchanan. He's sticking a stick into the wheels of his bike. So what he decided to do was to champion public choice theory and constitutional economics. High-minded names for a simple premise. Government is bad and self-interest individuals are all that matter. He insisted that his hyper-individualistic method was ideological neutrality, but it was anything but. He redefined rent-seeking to label any collective effort by citizens or public servants seeking government action involving tax revenues as like a greedy attempt to extract money. He assumed individuals always acted out of personal economic self-interest and completely dismissed any sort of motivation like compassion or fairness or social justice as irrelevant. In his view, a program like Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty could only be explained by politicians seeking political favor for votes, not genuine concern for the poor. Honestly, and I feel like it just tells you more about him than about anything else, that he can't understand that someone might actually just feel compassion for someone. That's so feeling was like makes me laugh. I laughed when I wrote this, but it's so silly. Feeling increasingly marginalized, Buchanan eventually left UVA. His departure, fueled by a dispute over a colleague's promotion, underscored his growing discomfort. The more diverse and democratizing university environment. He went to UCLA, but even there he reportedly disliked the city and found the school impersonal, seemingly uneasy with a number of Black Americans in the area. This wasn't just an academic dispute. It was a reflection of his deep-seated desire for a society structured specifically to his liking. So this is where Buchanan's intellectual blueprint found their master builder at something called the Mount Pelerin Society, which was a influential international network of libertarian and conservative intellectuals. It became a really crucial nexus. It was here that thinkers like Buchanan connected with wealthy individuals like Charles Koch, who was frustrated with traditional politics and seeking a systemic way to free capitalism from government interference. So Koch grasped the profound lesson from Goldwater's defeat and Buchanan's insights. Instead of trying to win public opinion election by election, they needed to change the rules of democracy itself. Naturally, of course. They realized that if they could legally shackle public officials and weaken collective power, then majorities couldn't impose policies that they opposed. Thus, they began a meticulously planned, multi-decade project to lay the pipes of the modern radical right, often operating behind the scenes. This wasn't a grassroots movement. It was a Trojan horse strategy designed to dismantle public services and regulations from within under the guise of efficiency or freedom. You ever notice how efficiency always seems to mean cutting something people need? Never like billionaire tax breaks? It's really funny how that works. The Koch network built a vast, interconnected infrastructure. The intellectual ammunition, the think tanks here, they poured vast sums into funding dozens of seemingly independent think tanks. Think the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the Mercatus Center, where Buchanan actually taught at George Mason University. So these think tanks produced, quote-unquote, scholarship and policy papers pushing libertarian and conservative economic ideas, which directly drew from Buchanan's theories. So they strategically funded university departments and professorships to cultivate academics who would promote their worldview, this anti-government free market principle, ensuring a steady stream of ideological thinkers that were aligned with them. So Koch also funded legal organizations like the Federalist Society, He pushed for legal interpretations that restrict government power, expand corporate liberties, and challenge environmental and social regulations. Cute, so much that he did. Then you have like your astroturfed grassroots stuff, where you have Americans for Prosperity and the State Policy Network that were established to create the appearance of broad citizen support for policies and anti-tax measures or deregulation, all which, of course, masked their corporate funding and agenda. So what else did Koch do? He also invested heavily in media outlets and cultivated conservative commentators to popularize their ideas, to reframe public debates, and to erode trust in mainstream institutions. This network systematically pushed policies that would erode the foundations of collective life and democratic responsiveness. They also chipped away, at anything that had to do with acknowledging climate change as a thing. The Koch network became a primary force behind funding climate change denial campaigns and lobbying efforts, directly protecting fossil fuel interests while undermining public trust in science. They also were the ones who pushed for right-to-work laws and other measures across states where they weakened labor unions and reduced the power of collective bargaining, further individualizing the workforce. Their philosophy translated into pushes to underfund public education, to privatize public services, to weaken social safety nets. Again, all framed as quote-unquote efficiency or individual freedom. Because, absolutely nothing screams freedom like having no buses or clean water or clear way to retire. This wasn't accidental either, right? We have established that this was a deliberate, long-term project to fundamentally reshape American society. Architects, people like Buchanan and the Koch network, they laid the intellectual and organizational pipes. They created the conditions. They eroded the trust. The celebration of individualism and the demonization of collective action that the alt-right now fills with their just hateful content. The infrastructure of a pipeline, it wasn't built overnight. It was meticulously constructed over decades to ensure that when the opportunity arose, the mechanism of this fuckery would be ready. So the next time you hear a dude in a red hat crying about personal freedom, you should ask, yeah, freedom for who? And remind him that pipe that he's riding real hard was laid by rich men who think that sidewalks are socialism. And that those men, they are the same heinous losers, that absolutely raw-dogged his future, that made his trust in science erode. So I know that this was my first episode, and I'm not going to lie, I am already looking forward to remaking it eventually, but I just needed to get this out and not worry so much about perfection and not worry that I still had 2 more books that I wanted to read and just really to flesh this out a lot more. But my girl, seriously, I could have been here all day. And this was already supposed to drop 2 weeks ago. And this is already at 25 pages. And at some point, I just got to rip off the Band-Aid and give you a messy first so I can get to my better second, And one thought, though, that I want to address as a preemptive and initial rebuttal is I can already hear some annoying right-wing reactionaries asking very smugly, well, who laid the left pipe? And to preempt that, the left doesn't have a pipeline because pipelines require capital, coordination, and a willingness to preserve hierarchy. 3 things antithetical to actual leftism. Also, we have no billionaire leftists because it's an oxymoron, right? The right has Koch and Musk and Thiel and Murdoch and billionaires who fund reactionary politics in order to protect their power in order to protect their wealth. And the left has, literally in the script I wrote like 12 question marks, because who do we have? Like, if we don't count just like rich liberals, because I don't think they count, we might have a handful of champagne socialists. But I'm going to cut them a break, because there's a big difference between being able to buy a nice bottle of champagne and like a rocket ship. Okay, so we don't have any space yacht socialists. Okay, we don't have any people with the bag enough to create a leftist pipeline, and we wouldn't take to it anyways. But real leftism is a threat to capital, right? You can't really grift a movement that, if successful, would dismantle the systems that made the grift profitable. You can't beef tallow your way into a Marxist grift. Really, no. So you have the horseshoe theory, though, which is just a really boring coping mechanism for people who can't handle nuance. It's the idea that both sides are equally extreme. Like, just boring. It's saying that the right pipeline is top-down, well-funded, and designed to radicalize, so therefore the left must have an equivalent. That's the whole premise of it, that like each side is equally bad at different points. But the left's radicalization really is just people reading theory and unionizing. One side has a coordinated decade-long plan to seize power. The other has infighting over whether it's ethical to, I don't know, like read your old Harry Potter books, even as a non-monetary support of the IP, because that sends bad juju. Okay. To be clear, though, don't watch the new HBO show, because fuck J.K. Rowling. But those are the arguments that we have on the left. Okay. Meanwhile, the left's pipeline is just slowly realizing capitalism sucks. The right-wing pipeline, you start with a video game outrage about, the character being too DEI, and then you somehow end up watching videos that, talk about conspiracy theories and actual anti-Semitism. Okay. The left-wing pipeline, though, you start with stuff like, why don't I have any health care? And then you just end up being radicalized into class consciousness. So one is manufactured rage for profit. The other is organic disillusionment with a broken system, where the right unites under hierarchy. Like, they really like their strongman leaders and a rigid ideology. Weird. They should look into that, why they like that so much. The left constantly critiques itself, because liberation movements must evolve. And this isn't a weakness, it's accountability. But it does make organizing really, really hard when everyone's busy debating whether it's ethical to stand a YouTuber that once liked a problematic tweet. By the way, yes, it's fine. People change. We need to have more good faith and more grace for people on the left. The right pipeline is active indoctrination. The left's pipeline is capitalism doing its thing. People getting evicted, people going into medical debt and realizing, oh, maybe eating the rich is actually a good idea. So the right builds pipelines because it needs them to maintain power. The left doesn't have one, because you can't institutionalize a movement that's inherently anti-institutional. The left's pipeline is just life under late-stage capitalism, and honestly, I think that's why eventually it will be more effective than any Koch-funded think tank. So that was a lot and kind of depressing. Can we leave on a high note? Is there a way out? I would argue that there is. And the way out is in the reclaiming of the us, reclaiming of the we. Because the pipe can only carry what we fail to hold together. What do I mean by that? The alt-right pipeline doesn't win on logic. It wins on loneliness and engineered feelings. It offers a false sense of belonging, a manufactured identity built on shared grievance and exclusion. Preys on the spaces where genuine community has been systematically eroded by patriarchy and white supremacy and capitalism, leaving us isolated and anxious and ripe for exploitation. But what if we actively cultivated the opposite? Historically, human beings have always found ways to connect, to support each other, to create mutual aid networks that defy market logic. Guilds, rotating credit associations, harvest festivals, even informal neighborhood childcare. These weren't just economic arrangements. They were the very embodiment of us, of we. These systems weren't lost. They were stolen, systematically undermined because they threatened the isolation that fuels competitive individualism. So, to start the pipe, we have to reclaim those blueprints for connection. For every tenant union, every community fridge, every worker co-op, every space where we build genuine bonds of interdependence, those are not just acts of resistance. They are acts of rehumanization. They are the antidote to the pipeline's toxic offer of identity through hate. The alt-right promises power through dominance. We offer strength through vulnerability. They offer certainty through dogma. We offer meaning through shared struggle and radical care. They offer a script of fear. We can write one of solidarity and courage and genuine connection. As Mikki Kendall writes in Hood Feminism, sometimes solidarity is as simple as step up, reach back, and keep pushing forward. It's in the quiet, consistent work of building real communities, of caring for each other, of relearning how to say and truly embody that we dismantle the pipe, connection by connection, and build a world where, sounds cheesy as fuck, but where we all belong. Because maybe we could have a world where our neighbor Pam realizes that beef tallow is not going to fix the systemic fuckery, but actual community just might.